The dust tasted of failure. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated the tongue and settled in the back of the throat, a taste Hina had come to know as the defining flavor of this new country. It rose in a cloud from the wheels of Jedediah Barlow's buckboard and settled on the shoulders of her dark traveling suit, a garment that had been respectable in San Francisco, but looked alien and foolish here, under the immense, unblinking sky of the Wyoming Territory. The buckboard groaned to a halt, and the silence that followed was louder than the rattling journey had been. Before them stood a house that seemed to be in a long, losing argument with the wind. It was a simple clapboard structure, its paint scoured away by seasons of sun and ice, leaving the wood a pale, splintered gray. A porch sagged. A single window stared out like a blind eye. Jedediah Barlow did not get down. He sat holding the reins, a man whose bulk seemed to press the seat down into the wagon's frame. He had the soft, prosperous look of someone who profited from the labor of others. He had picked her up from the train station in Cheyenne, his manner a sour mix of obligation and impatience. He had not spoken more than a dozen words to her in 2 days. Now he cleared his throat, a sound like gravel turning over. "This is it," he said, not to her, but to the house itself. A man came out onto the porch. He did not hurry. He moved with a weariness that seemed to have settled deep in his bones, a permanent part of his structure. He was tall and lean, his shoulders stooped not from age but from a weight that was invisible. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, carved by sun and worry. He stopped at the edge of the porch, his hand resting on one of the peeling support posts, and waited. His eyes, the gray of creek stones after rain, took in the buckboard, then Barlow, and then finally Hina. There was no welcome in them. There was nothing in them at all but a deep, settled exhaustion. "Silas," Barlow said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who held all the cards, "got something for you." The man on the porch, Silas, did not answer. His gaze remained on Hina, flat and unreadable. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap over her small satchel. Inside it was a change of clothes, a book of Japanese poetry, and a small, smooth stone her mother had given her for luck. The luck, it seemed, had run out somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. She had been promised a merchant husband in California. She had gotten 2 months of servitude in a laundry before being told the contract had been sold, that she was part of a different arrangement now. She was a debt. That was the word Barlow had used. An asset to be transferred. "I'm calling it square," Barlow announced to the vast empty space between them. "The note, the interest. You take her, and the slate's clean." Silas's hand tightened on the wooden post. A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked from Hina back to Barlow, and for the first time, a flicker of something raw and hot showed in his eyes. "You can't be serious, Jedediah." "As a heart attack," Barlow said, a faint, unpleasant smile touching his lips. "I have no use for her. Was supposed to be a housekeeper for my cousin back east, but he passed. I've got my own arrangements, but you, Silas, you're in need. A boy with no mother, a house falling to pieces, and a debt you'll never pay. I'm doing you a favor." The word favor hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Hina understood enough English to know its meaning and to understand the lie of it. This was not a favor. This was a disposal. She was being discarded, left on this desolate stoop like an unwanted parcel. She kept her back straight, her chin level. She would not show them the cold knot of fear in her stomach. She would not give them the satisfaction. Silas finally moved, stepping down from the porch. He walked to the side of the buckboard, his boots scuffing in the thick dust. He was closer now, and she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair was threaded with gray at the temples. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she met his gaze without flinching. She was small, fine-boned, and dressed in clothes that were wholly wrong for this place. He saw a fragile thing, another mouth to feed, another problem he did not have the strength to solve. He saw a burden. "What am I supposed to do with her?" Silas asked, his voice low and rough. "Whatever you want. She cooks, cleans, I suppose." "They're taught to be obedient," Barlow said with a dismissive wave of his hand. He turned his gaze to Hina. "Get down." It was an order. Hina did not move. Her eyes remained on Silas. It was his land, his house. He was the one who mattered. She was waiting for his word, not Barlow's. This small act of defiance, this silent appeal to his authority over the other man's, was the only power she had. A flicker of surprise crossed Silas's face. He had expected tears or pleading or frightened compliance. He got none of it. He got a quiet, waiting stillness. Barlow grunted in annoyance. "Deaf, is she? Get down," I said. He made a move as if to get up. Suddenly, a small boy, no more than 7 or 8, appeared in the dark doorway of the house. He was pale and thin, with his father's dark hair and a lost, watchful expression. He held a half-eaten apple in one hand and stared at the scene, his eyes wide. The sight of the boy seemed to change something in the air. The harshness of the transaction became sharper, more shameful. Silas's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at his son, then hardened again as he turned back to Barlow. "Leave her be," Silas said, the words quiet but carrying the weight of iron. He looked back at Hina. He still did not want her here. His whole posture screamed it. But the sight of his son watching, the sight of Barlow's casual cruelty, had shifted the balance. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a welcome. It was a concession. Permission. Only then did Hina move. She did so with a fluid, economical grace, swinging her legs over the side and placing her worn boots on the ground. She stood, pulling her small satchel with her, and faced the house. She did not look back at Barlow. He was the past. The house and the man and the boy. This was the terrifying, uncertain present. Barlow laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Suit yourself, then." He slapped the reins, and the buckboard lurched forward, turning in a wide, dusty arc and heading back the way it had come, leaving Hina standing alone in the yard. She stood there for a long moment, a small, dark figure against the vast, pale landscape. The wind tugged at her jacket. The boy in the doorway took a hesitant step out onto the porch. Silas watched her, his expression a mask of grim resignation. He had just traded a debt he understood, a debt of money, for one he did not. He looked at her worn boots, her straight back, the determined set of her jaw, and felt the weight of his world settle a little heavier on his shoulders. What in God's name had he just done? Hina took a slow breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. Then she walked toward the sagging porch, toward the boy, toward the man who now owned her life. She stopped at the bottom step and bowed, a gesture so formal and out of place that it was almost shocking. "My name is Hina," she said, her voice clear and steady, though it cost her everything she had. "I will work." The silence inside the house was as thick as the dust on the furniture. For 2 days, Hina had moved through it like a ghost, cleaning, sorting, organizing. She started in the kitchen, a room that had surrendered to neglect. She had scoured the soot-blackened stove until the maker's name was visible again in the cast iron. She had scrubbed the wooden countertops down to the bare grain. She had found a half-empty sack of flour, a tin of lard, some dried beans, and a handful of withered potatoes in the root cellar. From these meager supplies, she produced meals that were simple but nourishing. Hot biscuits in the morning, a thick bean soup for lunch, potato cakes for supper. Silas and the boy Leo ate without comment. They sat at the newly scrubbed kitchen table and accepted the food she placed before them. Silas ate like a man fueling a machine, his movements efficient, his eyes on his plate. Leo ate slowly, his gaze often drifting to Hina as she moved quietly about the room. He seemed less a child and more a small, wary animal, studying a new and unpredictable element in his territory. Hina learned the rhythms of the house, of the men who worked the ranch. There were 3 hands besides Silas. Billy, a young man with a ready, nervous smile, who was the first to thank her for a meal. Gus, a thick-set man in his 40s with suspicious eyes and a perpetual scowl, who seemed to view her presence as a personal affront. And Elias, an old man with a face like a dried riverbed, who said nothing at all but watched everything from under the brim of his hat. He saw the way Hina mended a tear in Billy's shirt without being asked. He saw the way she saved the vegetable peelings and bacon grease, wasting nothing. On the 3rd morning, the crisis was small, but absolute. The coffee ran out. Silas came into the kitchen before dawn, his face grim, and held up the empty tin. It was a final punctuation mark on a long sentence of hardship. For a rancher, coffee was not a luxury, it was the fuel that started the engine. "There's no more," he stated, the words flat. It was an accusation and a declaration of defeat all in one. The general store was a day's ride away, a trip he could not afford to make. Hina looked at the empty tin. Then she looked toward the pantry she had been slowly organizing. She went to it, took out a small, heavy cast-iron skillet, and retrieved a handful of shriveled, dark objects from a bowl on the shelf. They were chicory roots she had found growing wild near the creek bed, which she had dug up, washed, and left to dry near the stove. She did not say a word. She moved to the stove, which was already warming with a low fire she had built in the pre-dawn chill. She chopped the roots into small, even pieces and tossed them into the skillet. Soon a rich, dark, toasty smell began to fill the kitchen. A scent that was not quite coffee, but was its close, respectable cousin. Silas stood by the doorway, watching her. He had walked past those weeds by the creek 1,000 times and seen nothing but weeds. He watched her grind the roasted pieces with the back of a spoon against a stone, her movements precise and unhurried. He watched her brew the dark grounds. She poured the steaming liquid into his tin mug and held it out to him. He took it, the heat warming his calloused hands. He raised it to his lips and drank. It was strong, bitter, and hot. It was not coffee, but it was enough. It was a small, stubborn miracle conjured from dirt and ingenuity. He looked at her over the rim of the mug. For the first time, his gaze held something other than weary resignation. It was a flicker of grudging respect. He had seen a problem with no solution. She had seen a solution where he had not even seen a problem. He gave a curt nod, the closest he could come to a thank you, and walked out into the gray morning light. Later that day, Hina took a bucket and a brush to the porch. The wood was gray and splintered, but sound. She scrubbed away years of accumulated dirt and grime, her arms aching with the effort. Leo came out to watch her, sitting on the top step with his knees drawn to his chest. He still had not spoken a single word directly to her. She worked without looking at him, but she was aware of his presence in every movement. When she finished a section, she rinsed it with clean water, and the wood emerged from its gray shell, revealing a warmer, honeyed color underneath. It was like watching something come back to life. "My mama used to do that," Leo said, his voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the wind. Hina stopped scrubbing. She turned to look at him. His eyes were fixed on the clean patch of wood, a wistful, lonely expression on his small face. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply nodded, a small acknowledgement of his memory, of his loss. Then she dipped her brush back in the bucket and continued her work. But the space between them had changed. A wall had been breached. He had offered a piece of his past, and she had received it with quiet respect. He stayed there until she had finished the entire porch, the silence between them no longer empty, but companionable. The proof of her competence was not in a single grand act, but in 100 small methodical ones. It was in the way the house slowly began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. The windows were clean, letting in more light. The thin blankets on the beds were patched and mended. The meals, though, still made from the barest of ingredients, were regular and filling. She brought order to the chaos, not with force or loud commands, but with the steady, quiet application of effort. She worked from before the sun rose until long after it set, her movements economical, without wasted motion. She was not trying to impress anyone. This was simply who she was. She was a person who saw what was broken and fixed it. She saw what was empty and filled it. The men on the ranch noticed. Billy started bringing her little things from his rides, a handful of wild berries, an interesting feather. Elias, the old man, began leaving a small pile of perfectly chopped kindling by the kitchen door every morning. They were small gestures of acceptance, of respect. Only Gus remained resistant. He saw her quiet efficiency not as a virtue, but as a threat. She was changing things. The comfortable masculine squalor he was used to was being replaced by a clean, orderly world he didn't understand. Her presence was a silent rebuke to his own way of living. He watched her with narrowed eyes, looking for a mistake, a weakness, a reason to confirm his suspicion that she did not belong. He would find his moment to challenge her. It was only a matter of time. The kitchen had become Hina's domain. It was the warm, beating heart of the ranch house, and from it, she exerted a quiet, steady influence. The men who had once eaten in sullen silence now talked more freely across the long wooden table. Billy would recount stories from the day's ride, his youthful energy filling the room. Elias would offer a rare, dry comment that invariably made Billy laugh. Even Silas seemed less burdened at the dinner table, the deep lines on his face softening in the warm lamplight. Only Gus held himself apart. He would take his plate of food and eat it on the porch, even as the evenings grew colder. He was a boulder in the stream of the changing household, refusing to be moved. His resentment was a palpable thing, a sour note in the slowly harmonizing life of the ranch. The confrontation, when it came, was over something small. A pie. Hina had found a forgotten crate of apples in the back of the root cellar. Most were rotten, but she had salvaged enough to make a deep dish apple pie. The first sweet thing the men had tasted in months. Its aroma filled the house, a warm, cinnamon-scented promise. When she brought it to the table after supper, a rare, genuine smile touched Billy's face. Elias's eyes lit up. Even Silas allowed himself a moment of anticipation. Hina cut the first slice and placed it on a plate for Leo, who looked at the steaming dessert with wide, reverent eyes. Gus stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. "What did you use for sugar?" he demanded, his voice accusatory. He knew as well as anyone that the sugar tin had been empty for weeks. "Molasses," Hina answered simply, not turning from her task. "And honey from the comb Billy brought." "Waste of good molasses," Gus grumbled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Wasting our supplies on the fancy things we don't need. We need salt pork and beans. Not that." He gestured at the pie with contempt. The room went quiet. Billy looked down at his hands. Silas's face hardened. The brief moment of peace shattered. This was more than a complaint about a pie. It was a direct challenge to Hina's place, to her judgment. Hina placed a slice of pie in front of Silas, then another in front of Billy. She did not stop working. Her movements remained calm and deliberate. She straightened up and finally turned to face Gus. She held the pie server in her hand, its edge catching the lamplight. It was not a weapon, but in that moment, it was a symbol of her authority in this kitchen, in this house. "There is enough," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The molasses was not wasted. It was used to make our food better. This makes the men's spirits better. A man with good spirits works harder. It is not a waste. It is an investment." Her logic was simple, direct, and unassailable. She had not become angry or defensive. She had met his aggression with a calm statement of fact. She had taken his crude complaint and elevated it into a discussion of morale and productivity, a language he, as a working man, had to understand. Gus was taken aback. He had expected her to shrink, to be intimidated. He was left standing in the doorway, his own anger suddenly looking foolish and petty. He searched for another line of attack. "You don't know anything about running a ranch. You're just a foreigner." The word was meant to be an insult, a final damning piece of evidence against her. Before Hina could respond, Silas spoke. He had not touched his pie. He had been watching the exchange, his expression unreadable. "She knows how to make a house a home, Gus," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "which is more than I can say for you. She's made this place better in a month than you have in 5 years. Now you can either sit down and eat your supper with the rest of us, or you can find somewhere else to draw your pay." The ultimatum was stark and absolute. It was the first time Silas had openly and decisively taken her side. He was no longer just a passive observer of her work. He was its defender. He was validating her role, her authority, her belonging. Gus stared at Silas, his face turning a dull red. He looked at Hina, who stood her ground, her expression calm. He looked at the faces of the other men at the table, who were all watching him, waiting. He had lost. He knew it. With a muttered curse, Gus turned and stomped out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The tension in the room broke. Billy let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. Elias picked up his fork and, with a small, almost smile, took a bite of his pie. His eyes closed for a moment in quiet appreciation. Hina looked at Silas. Their eyes met across the table. In his gaze, she saw a confirmation, a partnership. He had drawn a line in the sand, and he had placed her on his side of it. She gave him a small, formal bow of her head, a gesture of respect and gratitude. He responded with a curt nod, but it was a nod that meant everything. She turned and cut another slice of pie, placing it on a plate. She walked to the door and opened it, stepping out into the cool night air. Gus was sitting on the edge of the porch, his shoulders slumped. She walked over and held the plate out to him. He looked up, surprised and sullen. He stared at the pie, then at her face. He saw no triumph there, no gloating, only a simple, quiet offering. He hesitated, then slowly reached out and took the plate. "Obliged," he mumbled, not looking at her. Hina went back inside, closing the door softly behind her. The war was over. She had won, not by fighting, but by refusing to fight on his terms. She had won through competence, dignity, and a small final act of grace. The incident with the pie marked a turning point. Gus was never warm, but his open hostility vanished, replaced by a grudging, silent respect. He started eating his meals at the table again. The ranch settled into a new rhythm, a harmony that Hina had orchestrated. But as the external pressures on the ranch eased, Hina's keen, observant eyes began to notice a deeper, more insidious problem. Silas kept his books in a large leather-bound ledger that sat on a desk in the corner of the main room. He would sit there late at night, a single lamp casting long shadows, his brow furrowed in concentration as he went over the numbers. Hina watched him from the kitchen, saw the slump of his shoulders, the weary way he would rub his eyes. The numbers, she knew, were not telling him a happy story. One evening, after Leo was asleep and the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, she brought Silas a cup of the roasted chicory brew. He looked up from the ledger, his eyes tired. "Thank you, Hina," he said. He had started using her name. She placed the cup on the desk, her gaze falling on the open page. It was a mess of columns and scribbled figures. She could see at a glance that the math was clumsy, that Silas, for all his skill with cattle and horses, was not a man of numbers. "The books are a worry," she stated, not as a question, but as an observation. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The books are a nightmare. Every year we get further behind. Barlow's prices for feed, the rates from the railway. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom." He looked at the ledger with open disgust. "My wife, Sarah, she handled all this. She had a mind for it." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife by name. It was a small opening, a crack in the wall of his grief. Hina listened, her expression calm and patient. "I am good with numbers," she said quietly. It was a simple statement of fact, offered without pride or arrogance. In Japan, her father had been a merchant. He had taught her the abacus, taught her how to read a ledger, how to see the story that numbers told. Silas looked at her, skepticism warring with desperation in his eyes. He saw a small woman whose life had been spent with cooking pots and sewing needles. He could not imagine her making sense of this financial chaos. But then he remembered the chicory, the mended harnesses, the flawlessly organized pantry. He remembered her calm, unassailable logic. "Be my guest," he said, pushing the ledger toward her with a gesture that was half challenge, half surrender. For the next week, Hina spent her evenings at the desk. After the supper dishes were washed and the kitchen was quiet, she would light the lamp and bend over the ledger. At first, she just organized. She rewrote the messy pages in a neat, clear script, her characters precise and elegant. She corrected Silas's faulty arithmetic. But as she went deeper back through the years, she began to see a pattern. It was in the receipts from the general store in town, which was owned by a cousin of Jedediah Barlow. The prices for grain, for salt licks, for tools were consistently 10% higher than the prices on the supplier catalogs she found tucked away in a drawer. It was in the transport manifest from the railway. The weight of his cattle was always recorded as slightly less at the stockyards than it was when it left the ranch, and the fee per pound was always a fraction of a cent higher than the official rate. Individually, they were small discrepancies, easily dismissed as mistakes or market fluctuations. But taken together year after year, they told a clear story. Silas was not just failing. He was being systematically bled dry. Jedediah Barlow had not simply held a single note over Silas's head. He had been weaving a web of debt and dependency around him for years, ensuring the ranch would eventually fail and fall into his hands for pennies on the dollar. The note he had forgiven in exchange for Hina was just the final, public piece of a much larger, more patient theft. She gathered her evidence carefully. She cross-referenced the receipts with the old catalogs. She made new columns in the ledger, showing the price paid versus the price that should have been paid. The numbers were stark. The overcharges, compounded over 5 years, amounted to a staggering sum, enough to have kept the ranch solvent, even profitable. One night she was ready. Silas sat at the kitchen table, cleaning a rifle, the lamplight glinting off the oiled steel. Hina brought the ledger and placed it in front of him. She opened it to a fresh page where she had summarized her findings in 2 neat columns. What you paid and what it cost. You are not a poor businessman, Silas-san, she said, using the honorific for the first time. It was a sign of deep respect. You are a victim of theft. He stared at the page. He looked at the neat columns, the clear, damning arithmetic. He traced the lines of her writing with a calloused finger. He picked up a handful of the receipts she had laid out and compared them to the catalog prices she had circled. A slow, cold fury began to build in his eyes. It was the anger of a man who realizes he has been played for a fool, that his trust has been used as a weapon against him. He had thought Barlow was a hard man, a shrewd negotiator. He had not realized he was a common thief. That son of a bitch, he whispered, the words tight with rage. He looked up at Hina, his face a storm of emotions. The shame of being deceived, the anger at the betrayal, and something else, a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had not just cleaned his house, she had given him back his dignity. She had shown him that his failure was not his own fault. He did this because he thought no one was looking, Hina said calmly. He thought you were just a simple rancher, too busy with cows to check the numbers. He underestimated you. She paused. He underestimated us. The word hung in the air between them. Us. It was a quiet declaration. They were no longer just a man and his bonded servant. They were a partnership, forged in the face of a common enemy. Silas looked at her, at this small, quiet woman who had seen what he could not see, who had armed him with the one thing he needed to fight back, the truth. What do we do? He asked. The question was not a command. It was a genuine request for counsel. He was no longer the sole authority on this ranch. He was asking his partner for a plan. Hina looked at the ledger and then back at him. Her eyes were clear and resolute. First, she said, we stop the bleeding. We will buy our supplies from the rail stop store in Rock Creek from now on. It is further, but the prices are fair. Second, we make a copy of all of this. She tapped the pile of receipts. Evidence. And third, we wait. A man like Mr. Barlow is not used to being patient. When he sees his plan is not working, he will make a mistake, and we will be ready. Silas listened, a sense of clarity settling over him for the first time in years. The weight on his shoulders had not vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer the dead weight of despair, but the solid, manageable weight of a fight he now knew how to win. He looked at Hina, a woman who had been brought to his door as a piece of property, and saw an ally, a strategist, a mind as sharp and true as forged steel. The debt he had owed to Barlow was nothing compared to the debt he now owed to her. The first snows came early that year, dusting the high peaks with white and bringing a sharp, clean bite to the air. The shift in the ranch's fortunes was subtle, but real. With Hina managing the books and their supplies now coming from the honest merchants in Rock Creek, the slow drain on their resources stopped. For the first time in years, the ledger showed a thin, fragile margin of black ink instead of the familiar, sprawling red. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. As Hina had predicted, Jedediah Barlow did not take the change well. He saw the Blackwood wagon rolling through town on its way to Rock Creek and understood immediately what it meant. He had lost his easiest source of income, and more importantly, his primary means of strangling Silas's ranch. His visits to the ranch, which had once been infrequent, became more common. He would ride up, ostensibly to check on a fence line or discuss a stray, But his real purpose was to probe, to search for weakness, to see the effects of his thwarted plan. He would ignore Hina completely, looking through her as if she were a piece of furniture. But he saw the changes she had wrought. He saw the clean porch, the mended harnesses hanging in neat rows, the look of health in the milk cow she kept near the house. He saw the subtle but undeniable air of order and purpose that had settled over the place, and he hated it. The ranch was supposed to be dying. Instead, it was showing signs of recovery. One afternoon, Barlow cornered Silas near the corral. "Heard you're taking your business all the way to Rock Creek now, Silas," he said, his voice slick with false friendliness. "My cousin at the general store is wondering if he's done something to offend you." Silas finished tightening a cinch on his saddle before he turned to face him. He looked Barlow directly in the eye. "Your cousin's prices offended me," he said, his voice flat and even. "I found a better deal." Barlow's smile tightened. "A man ought to be loyal to his neighbors. We're all in this together, after all." "Some of us more than others," Silas replied, swinging himself up into the saddle. He looked down at Barlow, the position giving him a slight but satisfying advantage. "I'm just looking out for my own, Jedediah. You of all people should understand that." He gave a curt nod and rode off, leaving Barlow standing in the dust, his face dark with fury. The Cold War simmered for weeks. Then the real crisis materialized, just as Heine had known it would. It was not a direct confrontation, but something far more dangerous. It arrived in the form of an official-looking letter delivered by a circuit rider. It was a legal notice of a water rights claim. Barlow, citing a long-forgotten territorial survey from the 1860s, was claiming exclusive rights to the creek that flowed down from the mountains, the very creek that was the lifeblood of Silas's ranch. The claim stated that the original survey granted the upstream property, Barlow's property, primary access, and that Silas's use of the water was permissive, not guaranteed. Barlow was now revoking that permission. He was, with the stroke of a pen, threatening to turn Silas's pastures to dust. The blow was devastating. Without that water, the ranch could not survive a month, let alone a summer. The cattle would have to be sold off for pennies on the dollar. The land would become worthless. It was a checkmate move, a perfectly legal way to destroy him. Silas was trapped. He stormed into the house, the letter crumpled in his fist, his face ashen. "He's done it," he said, his voice rough with despair. "He's found a way. He's taking our water." He explained the claim to Hina, the legal jargon, the old survey. The local land office was in Cheyenne, a 3-day ride away. A hearing was set for 2 weeks' time. Even if Silas could get there, what could he do? He had no legal papers of his own, only the deed to his land, which said nothing specific about the water. He was a rancher, not a lawyer. Barlow would have his own man there, a slick talker from back east. Silas would be ruined. That night, a feeling of utter defeat settled over the ranch house. Silas sat by the cold hearth, staring into the embers, the fight seemingly gone out of him. He was a man pushed to the edge of a cliff, with nowhere left to go. The external threat had materialized, and he was powerless against it. Hina watched him, her heart aching for his despair. She brought him his dinner, but he didn't touch it. She knew that this was the moment she had warned him about. Barlow, having failed to ruin them slowly, was now moving to ruin them all at once. After Silas had gone to bed, surrendering to a fitful, exhausted sleep, Hina went to the old wooden chest where Sarah Blackwood's things were kept. Silas had told her to clear it out months ago, but she had never felt it was her place. Now she opened it. The scent of dried lavender and old paper rose to meet her. Inside were dresses, a child's blanket, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, and at the very bottom a heavy tin document box. She lifted it out and placed it on the table. It was locked. She found a small iron poker from the fireplace, and with a sharp, decisive crack, broke the simple lock. Inside were the founding documents of the ranch, the original land grant signed by President Grant, the deed of sale from the previous owner, tax records, and a thick folded document tied with a faded green ribbon. Hina carefully untied it. It was a hand-drawn map of the property, dated 1875, the year Silas's father had bought the land. It was beautifully rendered, with notes in a neat cursive hand. Hina's English was good, but this formal, legal language was difficult. She spent hours with a dictionary that had also been in the chest, painstakingly translating the words, and then she found it. A small annotation on the section of the map showing the creek. It was a reference to a separate agreement filed with the original deed. It was a riparian covenant, a formal contract between the upstream and downstream landowners at the time, guaranteeing shared and equitable use of the creek's water in perpetuity. The covenant was explicitly designed to prevent exactly what Barlow was now trying to do. It was legally binding on all future owners of both properties. Her heart hammered in her chest. This was it. This was the weapon they needed. But it was not enough. The covenant mentioned that it was filed with the Territorial Land Office. Barlow's claim was based on a survey. This was a superseding legal agreement, but they had to prove it. They needed the official copy from Cheyenne. Silas was leaving for the hearing in the morning, a journey of grim necessity. He planned to go and stand before the commissioner and make a simple plea for fairness, knowing it would fail. Hina knew she could not let him go alone or unprepared. Before dawn, she woke him. She had a pack ready with food. She had the tin box with the map and her notes. "I am coming with you," she said. It was not a request. He stared at her confused. "Hina, you can't. It's a hard ride, and Leo—" "Elias will watch Leo," she said. "He is a good man. This is more important. You cannot fight them alone. You do not have the proof. I believe the proof is in Cheyenne. We must find it." She showed him the map, pointed to the covenant, explained what she had discovered. Hope, a fragile and unfamiliar emotion, began to dawn on his face. It was a long shot. The document could be lost, misfiled. But it was a chance. It was more than he'd had 12 hours before. "All right," he said, his voice firm again, the despair replaced by a new, sharp resolve. "All right, Hina, we ride together." They left as the first pale light touched the eastern sky. Hina, dressed in a divided skirt and a heavy wool coat she had altered from one of Sarah's, rode a steady mare. She was not a natural horsewoman, but she was determined. She watched Silas riding ahead of her, his back straight and his shoulders square against the vast cold landscape. He was no longer a man walking to his own execution. He was a man riding into a fight, with his partner at his side. The crisis had pushed them to the brink, but in doing so, it had also forged them into an unbreakable unit. The journey to Cheyenne was brutal. A relentless wind swept across the plains, carrying the chill of the high country snow down into the lowlands. Hina rode with a quiet endurance that surprised Silas. She never complained. When they stopped to rest the horses, she would have bread and dried meat ready. She seemed to draw strength from some deep internal well of resilience. Silas found himself watching her, marveling at her fortitude. He had seen her as capable in the home, a place of warmth and order. He was now seeing that same quiet competence manifest itself in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness. They arrived in Cheyenne on the evening of the second day, covered in dust and exhausted to the bone. They took a room at a modest boarding house, and while Silas tended to the horses, Hina washed up and studied her notes again, rehearsing the words she would need. The next morning, they walked to the Territorial Land Office, a formidable brick building that smelled of old paper, stale cigar smoke, and bureaucracy. The clerk was a man with a green eye shade and a profound lack of interest in their problems. "Blackwood versus Barlow, water rights," he droned, looking at a schedule. "Commissioner will hear it at 10. We need to see the original property filings for the Blackwood Ranch," Silas said, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "Parcel 37. The clerk sighed, a sound of profound suffering. "Archives are in the basement. Take you all day to find anything in that mess. Hearing's in an hour." He clearly intended to be of no help at all. Hina stepped forward. She bowed slightly to the clerk, a gesture of respect that seemed to momentarily disarm him. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and polite, "we are looking for a riparian covenant filed alongside the deed of sale. The year was 1875. The seller was a Mr. Abernathy. The buyer was Caleb Blackwood." Her precision was startling. She was not asking for a vague search. She was giving him specific, actionable information. The clerk's expression shifted from boredom to a flicker of professional interest. He looked at the Japanese woman in her neat but worn clothes, then at the grim-faced rancher beside her. "Abernathy," he mumbled, turning to a massive index book. He ran a grimy finger down a page. Abernathy to Blackwood. Yes. Lot 37. Says here, see also, Separate Covenant Filing, Volume 3, page 119. He looked up, a little surprised at himself. Well, I'll be. Volume 3. He disappeared into a back room. Minutes later, he returned with a dusty, leather-bound volume and laid it on the counter. He flipped through the brittle pages, and there it was, page 119, a document written in elegant script detailing the permanent and unbreakable agreement for shared water rights along the creek. It was signed by both original landowners and stamped with the official seal of the territory of Wyoming. It was irrefutable. Hina felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy. She looked at Silas, and he gave her a look of pure, unadulterated gratitude that was more eloquent than any words. At 10 o'clock, they were ushered into the commissioner's office. It was a large room, dominated by a massive oak desk. Commissioner Thompson was a stern-looking man with a thick mustache. Jedediah Barlow was already there, sitting in a chair looking smug and confident, with a slick, well-dressed lawyer by his side. Barlow's eyes widened in surprise when he saw Hina walk in with Silas. It was not part of his plan. Barlow's lawyer began, his voice smooth and condescending. He presented the old survey map, spoke of historical precedent and property rights, and painted Silas as a squatter, using water that was not rightfully his. It was a polished, convincing performance. When he was finished, the commissioner turned to Silas. Mr. Blackwood, your response? Silas stood up. He was not a man of fancy words. He placed the heavy ledger from the archives on the commissioner's desk, opened to page 119. Sir, he said, his voice steady, Mr. Barlow's claim is based on a survey. My claim is based on the law. The commissioner adjusted his spectacles and began to read. The room was silent. Hina watched Barlow's face. The smug confidence began to drain away, replaced by a dawning look of disbelief and then pure, venomous fury. He stared at Hina, his eyes full of hate. He understood, in that moment, who had done this. The insignificant woman he had discarded, the piece of property he had used to settle a debt, had just dismantled his entire scheme. Commissioner Thompson finished reading. He looked up, his expression grim. He looked at Barlow's lawyer. This covenant seems quite clear. It supersedes any general survey. It is a binding contract tied to the deeds of both properties. Did you not check the supplemental filings? The lawyer began to stammer, caught completely off guard. Well, sir, the survey was the primary document of record. The primary document, the commissioner interrupted, his voice like cracking ice, is the one that is legally binding. This covenant is. Mr. Barlow's claim is without merit. Dismissed. He slammed a wooden gavel down on his desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. It was over. They had won. Barlow shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. This is an outrage! That woman, she has no place here. She tricked him. The only trickery I see here, Mr. Barlow, the commissioner said, his voice dangerously low, is a frivolous and malicious claim designed to ruin your neighbor. Now I suggest you and your counsel leave my office before I find you in contempt. Defeated and humiliated, Barlow and his lawyer scurried from the room. Barlow shot one last hateful glare at Hina before he left. She met his gaze without fear, her expression calm and serene. His power over them was broken. His defeat was total, not just legally but morally. He had been exposed as a bully and a fraud. Silas and Hina stood alone in the office. Silas let out a long, slow breath, as if a great weight had been lifted from his chest. He looked at Hina, his eyes shining with an emotion she had never seen in him before. It was a mixture of awe, relief, and a deep, profound tenderness. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was large and calloused, engulfing her smaller one. Hina, he said, his voice thick with emotion, you didn't just save the ranch, you saved me. She simply squeezed his hand in return. The victory was not hers alone, nor was it his. It was theirs. They had faced the crisis together and had won, not with violence or force, but with intelligence, perseverance, and the quiet truth hidden in a dusty old book. The ride back to the ranch was different. The wind was still cold, but it no longer felt like an enemy. The sky, which had seemed so oppressive on the way to Cheyenne, now looked vast and full of promise. They rode side by side, a comfortable silence between them. There was little that needed to be said. Everything important had already been proven. When they crested the final rise and saw the ranch nestled in the valley below, smoke curling from the chimney, it looked different to both of them. It was no longer just a struggling piece of land. It was a sanctuary they had fought for and won. It was home. Leo, alerted by the sound of their approach, came running out of the house, followed by Billy and Elias. Gus stood on the porch, a rare, almost smile on his face. Leo ran straight to Silas, who swung down from his horse and swept the boy up into a massive hug. For the first time since his mother's death, the boy laughed, a clear, bright sound that seemed to chase the last of the shadows from the yard. That evening, after the celebratory meal was over and the house had settled into a peaceful quiet, Silas found Hina on the porch. She was looking out at the stars, which glittered like scattered diamonds in the cold, clear sky. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long moment. He was no longer the wary, beaten-down man she had first met. The lines of worry on his face had been replaced by a quiet strength, a renewed sense of purpose. The victory in Cheyenne had not just saved his land, it had restored his spirit. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low, "about the arrangement, about how you came to be here." Hina turned to look at him, her expression calm, waiting. "Barlow brought you here to settle a debt," Silas continued, his gaze steady on her face. "He saw you as property, and I was no better. I saw you as a burden, another problem I couldn't solve. I was wrong. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life." He took a breath. "You are not a servant in this house, Hina. You haven't been for a long time. You are the heart of it. You are my partner. I want to make that official, not just on the books, but in every way." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple object. It was a ring, a plain gold band. It had been his wife's. "This isn't about gratitude," he said, his voice earnest and raw. "And it isn't about paying a debt. God knows the debt I owe you could never be repaid. This is about wanting to build a life with you, to make this ranch a true home for you, for me, for Leo. I am asking you to be my wife, Hina, to be my partner in name as you already are in spirit." He was not offering her a contract. He was offering her a choice. He was offering her a place to belong, not out of obligation, but out of respect, admiration, and a deep, quiet love that had grown in the hard soil of their shared struggle. Tears welled in Hina's eyes. They were the first tears she had allowed herself to shed since leaving Japan. They were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of profound, overwhelming joy. Her journey had been long and full of hardship. She had been sold, discarded, and underestimated, but she had endured. She had used her mind, her spirit, and her quiet strength to not only survive, but to flourish. She had carved out a place for herself, and in doing so, had healed the broken family she had been cast into. She did not say yes immediately. Instead, she reached out and gently touched the weathered lines on his face. She had come to know this face so well, its grief, its worry, its anger, and now its hope. "In my country," she said softly, "a home is not just a building. It is the people inside it. It is the strength you build together." She looked from his eyes to the warm lighted window of the house, where Leo was sleeping safely in his bed. "We have already built a home, Silas-san." Then she smiled, a true, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. "Yes," she said, "I will be your wife." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time, he held her not as a rancher holding his partner, but as a man holding the woman he loved. Mitzgarm. The seasons turned. The harsh winter gave way to a green, hopeful spring. The ranch thrived. Under Hina's watchful eye and Silas's renewed energy, the fences were mended, the herd grew stronger, and the future, once a terrifying void, now seemed as wide and promising as the Wyoming sky. The house was filled with the sound of Leo's laughter, the smell of baking bread, and the quiet, steady rhythm of a family made whole. Jedediah Barlow, shamed and defeated, sold his land and moved away, a bitter ghost in their past. The ranch he had tried to steal, to possess, had never truly understood what it needed. It did not need a calculating owner or a legal title. What it needed was a heart. What it got was the woman who made it a home.